The night has a sound that most people never hear. Not the cars outside or the hum of the refrigerator or the distant siren that fades before it fully arrives. Those are just the city breathing. No, the sound of night makes us something underneath all of that, a frequency you can only access when the world has gone quiet enough, when the lights are off and the phone is face down, and there is nothing left between you and the dark. Most people fall asleep before they ever get there. Daniel was not most people. He had learned the sound of the night, the way you learn the layout of a room you've been trapped in for too long. Every corner, every echo, the particular quality of silence at 2 a.m. versus 3, the way the darkness seemed to shift texture somewhere around 4, becoming less like absence and more like a presence. He knew the night the way you only know something when you've had nothing else to do but study it, hour after hour, lying perfectly still while the rest of the world slept without effort or apology. He was 30 years old, and he could not remember the last time sleep had come easily. Not couldn't remember as in it had been a few rough weeks. Not couldn't remember as in he'd been stressed about work and his schedule had gotten off. He meant it in the deeper sense, the way you mean it when you reach back into memory and find a gap where something ordinary should be. Sleep, for Daniel, had become a foreign country, one he could see from across a border, could almost remember visiting once, but could no longer find a way back to. During the day, he was fine. That was the word people used. Fine. He used it himself. Someone would ask how he was doing, and he would say, fine, good, tired but fine, and they would nod and move on because the word fine is designed to end conversations, not begin them. And he was, in the daylight hours, genuinely functional. He went to work. He answered emails. He had lunch with colleagues and laughed at the right moments and contributed to meetings with enough coherence that no one looked at him with concern. No one saw what the nights were doing to him. No one knew about the hours. He had stopped trying to explain it, even to himself. In the beginning, and there had been a beginning, a time before this had become simply the shape of his life. He had tried to name what happened when he lay down and closed his eyes. Anxiety, maybe. Stress. Overactive mind. He had read things, tried things, downloaded apps that played rain sounds and ocean waves, and the low murmur of a coffee shop designed algorithmically to soothe the human brain into unconsciousness. He had tried go to bed later, go to bed earlier, cutting caffeine, increasing exercise, decreasing screens. None of it changed the essential fact. The moment the light went out, something woke up. He had no better way to describe it than that. It was as if there were two versions of him occupying the same body. The one that moved through the day with reasonable competence, and the one that waited, patiently, silently, with no regard for what he needed or wanted. The one that waited for the dark, and then began. Tonight was like every other night. He finished the last of what he'd been watching, without really watching it. His eyes on the screen, his mind already beginning to drift toward the hours ahead with a dread. He had become so accustomed he barely recognized it as dread anymore. It was just there, the knowledge of what was coming. The way a person who's been through the same bad experience enough times stops fearing the fear and simply notes its arrival. He turned everything off. The television, the lamp on the side table, the small light in the kitchen. He sometimes left on, not for any practical reason, but because darkness felt like a decision he had to keep making one light at a time. He lay down. He pulled the blanket up. He adjusted the pillow. He found the position he always started in, on his side, facing the wall, as if having something solid in his field of vision might keep him anchored to the physical world. He closed his eyes, and then his mind opened. It started, as it always started, with something small, a thought with no particular weight. Something from the day, a fragment of conversation, a thing he'd meant to do and hadn't. Ordinary mental residue, the stuff the brain processes during sleep, in people whose brains actually process things during sleep. In Daniel, these fragments didn't settle. They snagged. One would catch on another, and that one would catch on something else, and within minutes, he had timed it compulsively for a period. Within minutes, he was deep inside a chain of thought that seemed to have no beginning and offered no end. He would think about work. Not anything specific, just the ambient weight of it. The things undone, the things done imperfectly. Then work would lead to money, and money would lead to the future. And the future was a particular problem for Daniel at night. because the future, viewed from the position of a person who had not properly slept in years, looked nothing like it did in daylight. In daylight, the future was manageable, even occasionally promising. At night, the future was a corridor with no lights and no discernible end. And the only thing he could feel with any certainty was a thinning of his own resources, the slow withdrawal of whatever it was that had been sustaining him. He would catch himself thinking about his parents getting older, about friendships that had quietly contracted, not ended, exactly, just narrowed, become less frequent. The way things do in your 30s when everyone is busy and tired, and the work of maintaining connection starts to compete with the simpler relief of staying home, about choices he had made or not made in the years when he should have been paying more attention. These were not dramatic thoughts. They had no urgency in a way that nightmares have urgency, no narrative propulsion, no beginning, middle, or end. They were just there, cycling. The way a washing machine cycles when it has somehow become unbalanced, and instead of completing its spin, it just rotates endlessly, uselessly, generating noise and heat and accomplishing nothing. He would open his eyes, look at the ceiling. He had memorized the ceiling of his bedroom the way sailors once memorized star charts. He would close his eyes again. The thoughts would resume exactly where they had left off, as if they had simply been paused, as if they were waiting for him with a kind of gentle, relentless patience. By midnight, he had usually shifted positions 4 or 5 times. By 1, he was flat on his back, which was not how he slept, but had become how he lay when sleep was clearly not going to come, when he was in the maintenance phase of the night rather than the trying phase. By 2, the quality of everything had changed. His thoughts slower now, more distorted, less recognizably his own. The familiar things he'd been turning over had started to look different. The way familiar words look wrong if you stare at them long enough, like they're spelled incorrectly, like maybe they were never real words at all. He had a name for this hour. He called it the dissolving hour, though he'd never said the name out loud to anyone. It was the hour when the usual architecture of his thinking began to soften at the edges, when he could no longer be entirely sure whether he was thinking a thought or dreaming it, whether his eyes were open or closed, whether the sound he could hear was real or generated by a brain in the process of becoming desperate for the unconsciousness it was being denied. He would lie there in the dissolving hour and feel something he had no good word for. Not fear. Fear had an object. Fear was pointed at something. This was different. This was more like a pressure, a gentle, relentless, building pressure from no particular direction, pressing inward from all sides simultaneously, the way water presses on something submerged. He could feel it in his chest, behind his eyes, in the space between his shoulder blades. He had, at various points in the last several years, tried to explain this to people. Not many. He was not someone who explained himself easily, even in circumstances that called for it. But there had been moments, with his friend Marcus, once, on a night when they both had enough to drink that honesty felt briefly available, with a woman he'd been seeing for a few months who had woken at 3 a.m. to find him sitting in the kitchen with the lights off, staring at nothing. "I just can't sleep," he had said, as if that covered it. As if insomnia were simply the inability to locate unconsciousness, a logistical inconvenience, a matter of trying harder or differently, rather than this thing that happened in the dark, this specific and private war he fought every night in total silence while the rest of the world rested without trying. The woman had brought him a glass of water and told him to come back to bed, and he had. And she had fallen asleep within minutes while he lay beside her and watched the numbers on the clock change with the particular patience of someone who has long since given up. That relationship had ended, eventually, for reasons unrelated, officially. He had never connected the two things out loud. By 3 a.m, the city outside was as quiet as it ever got. And in that quiet, Daniel had learned to hear things he suspected most people were never meant to hear. The particular groan of a building settling. The sound of his own heartbeat, slightly too present, slightly too loud, like a reminder that his body was still here, still running, still keeping him alive whether he wanted it to or not. The distant sound of someone else awake somewhere, a light going on in the building across the way, a television murmuring, a door closing. These signs of other wakefulness had a complicated effect on him. On the one hand, they were evidence that he was not alone in the world, that other people also existed in these hours, that the night was not entirely as alone to endure. On the other hand, they made the isolation sharper, not softer. Because whoever was across the street, whoever had turned on that light at 3 in the morning, they would turn it off again. They would go back to sleep. They would wake in the morning and move through their day and sleep again the following night, as if none of it had been difficult. He did not know that for certain, but that was how it looked from here. He had been accumulating sleep debt for so long that he had stopped being able to calculate it. Sleep debt is what they call it. The scientific name for what happens when you take into account night after night without making sufficient deposits. At some point, the metaphor breaks down because actual debt can be repaid, can be addressed, has remedies. What Daniel had was less like debt and more like a structural deficit that had been present long enough to become simply the conditions of his existence. The fatigue was not like tiredness. People confuse this. He understood why. Because tiredness and fatigue share a surface similarity the way that a bruise and a wound share the surface similarity of being injuries. But tiredness is something you feel in your body. It is a message from muscles and organs that have been used and need rest. Fatigue. The particular fatigue of the chronically sleepless was something different. It was cognitive, firstly. The way his thoughts moved through molasses. The way words sometimes took an extra beat to arrive. The way faces had begun occasionally to lose their detail, to flatten slightly, like photographs of people rather than the people themselves. It was perceptual in ways he had started to find genuinely frightening. There were moments, not frequent, not yet severe enough to alarm anyone who didn't know what they were looking at, when the world appeared slightly wrong. Not wrong in any definable way, not hallucinations. More like the difference between looking at something directly and looking at it from the corner of your eye. Things in his peripheral vision seemed to move when he turned to look at them. Depth occasionally misbehaved. Light coming through windows at certain angles produced a flatness, a two-dimensionality, that lingered for seconds before the world reassembled itself correctly. He had not told anyone about this. He had developed a sophisticated internal taxonomy of the things he had not told anyone. At the top of the taxonomy was the simple fact that he was not managing. He had maintained for so long the performance of a person who was managing that the performance had become the public version of his life, the version that existed for colleagues and friends and family, the version that answered how are you with fine, the version that had a convincing enough surface that no one had reason to look beneath it. Beneath the surface was the dissolving hour. Beneath the surface was the ceiling he had memorized. Beneath the surface was a specific, unbearable loneliness of being awake while the world slept. A loneliness not of lacking people, because he had people, but of lacking the one experience that everything else depended on, the invisible foundation that most people never thought about because for them it had never been in question. He was not managing. He had not been managing for longer than he could honestly account for. And the strange thing, the thing that sometimes felt like the strangest thing of all, was that the days continued. The sun continued to rise with complete indifference to what his nights had been. The alarm continued to go off at 7, and he continued to silence it and stand under the shower and dress and leave the apartment. And the world continued to require him the things it had always required, and he continued mostly to provide them. He had become very good at the mornings. The mornings were survivable because the mornings had coffee and busyness, and a particular mercy of external demands. The morning asked nothing about the night. The morning presented a series of tasks: shower, dress, eat, commute, work. And the execution of these tasks was enough to fill the foreground of his mind and push the residue of the night back behind it, where it sat patiently and waited for its next opportunity. The mornings were survivable. It was everything after that was the problem. The afternoons had started to develop gaps. Not frequently, not dramatically, but there were moments, usually around 3 or 4, when the accumulated deficit of the previous nights seemed to assert itself with a directness that the rest of the day kept at bay. He would be in the middle of something, a spreadsheet, an email, a conversation, and there would be a skip, a break, a moment that felt less like distraction and more like absence, as if some part of him had simply clocked out for a few seconds without consulting the rest. He always came back. He always picked up exactly where he had left off, but the gaps were getting slightly longer. He had not told anyone about the gaps. There was a night, several weeks ago now, though time had begun to have a particular slipperiness for Daniel, when something happened that he had been turning over ever since. He had been in the dissolving hour, as usual, lying on his back in the dark, in the peculiar altered state that the sleepless mind occupies when it's been awake long enough to lose confidence in its own perceptions. The thoughts had been doing what they always did, cycling, catching, generating heat without light. And he'd been lying there with the flat, exhausted attention of a person who no longer had the energy to fight what he could not change. And then, with no warning, he had felt afraid. Not the background pressure, not the ambient dread of the hours. This was different. This was sharp and sudden, like stepping off a curb you didn't see. A lurch, a physical response, his heart suddenly loud in his chest and his hands gripping the blanket and his eyes opening to the darkness of his bedroom. He lay very still. There was nothing there. Of course there was nothing there. But the fear didn't leave when he established that. It stayed, insisting, a body-level alarm with no corresponding evidence. His nervous system having apparently decided that something was deeply wrong without consulting the part of him that understood there was nothing, objectively, to be afraid of. He had sat up, put his feet on the floor, turned on the lamp. The room was the room. His apartment was his apartment. The city was outside, doing what the city did. He sat on the edge of his bed at 3:45 in the morning with a lamp on and waited for the fear to pass. And it did, slowly, with a reluctance that suggested it had not entirely finished making its point. And he turned the lamp off and lay back down. But he had not forgotten it, because he understood, somewhere in a part of him that still had the clarity to understand things, what that moment had been. Not a supernatural event, not a mental break, just a body that had been running on almost nothing for so long that its warning systems had finally activated in the only way they knew how. His own nervous system was sounding the alarm. He had heard it. He had turned the lamp off and lain back down and waited for morning. The weeks that followed had a quality he had trouble naming in retrospect. The days remained functional, barely and with increasing effort, but functional. He was carrying more now, visibly, or would have been visible to someone looking closely. His colleague James had said once that he seemed distracted, and he had apologized and said he hadn't been sleeping well. And James had said that was rough, man, and the conversation had ended, and the moment had passed without becoming anything more than what it was. He had not slept well. The understatement was so comprehensive, he almost laughed, standing there in the hallway with James, holding a cup of coffee that would not help and that he was going to drink anyway. He had almost laughed at the distance between the words he had used and the reality they were supposed to describe. He had not slept well. For years. He had not slept well for years. He had lain in the dark for years while something inside him cycled and turned and refused to stop. And the body that was supposed to restore itself in those hours had been doing something else entirely, running, in a sense, on empty, drawing down reserves that had no schedule for replenishment, operating on a deficit so deep and so sustained that he was no longer sure what rest had felt like from the inside. He had not slept well. "Yeah," he had said to James, "I'm working on it." There was a Friday evening, 3 weeks after the night with the lamp, when Daniel sat his car in the parking garage beneath his building and could not immediately remember driving there. He remembered leaving the office. He remembered the elevator. He remembered the particular chill of the garage, the smell of concrete and exhaust that always struck him as strangely specific, a smell that belonged only to this place and no other. He did not remember the drive. He sat in the car with the engine off and tried to reconstruct it. The route he took every day, the turns, the lights, the particular intersection where he always had to wait, and found only fragments, impressions without sequence, the memory of movement without the content of it. He had driven home. He had arrived safely. The evidence was incontrovertible. He had not been present for it. He sat in the parked car in the garage beneath his building, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something he recognized, not the pressure, not the ambient dread, not the cycling thoughts or the dissolving hour or the specific loneliness of 3 a.m. He felt, for the first time and longer than he could account for, genuinely frightened, not of the dark, not of the night to come, though the night to come was already there, waiting, patient as it had always been, frightened of himself, of what was happening inside him, of the gap that had opened, not the small afternoon gaps, not the momentary absences, but this one, this hole in a 30-minute drive home, this evidence that the thing he had been living with had reached a threshold he hadn't known existed until he had crossed it. He sat in the car for a long time. The garage was quiet around him. Someone else's car arrived, parked, its driver emerging and heading toward the elevator without looking his way. Life continuing. Indifferent. He sat. He thought about calling someone. He took out his phone and looked at the names in his contacts. Marcus, James, his sister in another city, his mother who would worry, and try to imagine saying the words, "I need to tell you something. I have not been sleeping. Not in the way you mean when you say you're tired. Not in the way that resolves itself with a few early nights. I am driving home and not remembering the drive. I am lying in the dark every night while something inside me refuses to stop, refuses to quiet, refuses to give me the one thing I cannot function without. I am not managing." He held the phone. He put it back in his pocket. He got out of the car. He took the elevator up. He unlocked his apartment and went inside and made dinner on autopilot and ate it without tasting it and sat on the couch with the television on without watching it. And when the hour came, he turned everything off. The television, the lamp, the small light in the kitchen. He lay down. He closed his eyes. And the night opened, the way it always opened, like something that had been waiting for exactly this. But tonight was different from other nights in a way he could feel before it had fully arrived. A difference in pressure, in the weight of the dark, as if the weeks and months and years of this had been accumulating in some container he hadn't known existed. And that container had now reached its limit, and what happened in the hours ahead would not be the same as what had come before. The thoughts came. They always came. But tonight they came with a force he hadn't felt before, not louder, precisely, but closer, as if the distance between him and them had finally collapsed, as if the walls he had spent years constructing, the routines and the distractions and performance being fine, had all simultaneously become transparent, and he was left with nothing between himself and the full, unmediated weight of everything he had not addressed. The grief was there. He hadn't known he was carrying grief, but it was there, for the sleep he had lost, for the years of it, for the person he might have been with those years returned to him, rested and present and whole. The exhaustion was there, not just the tiredness. The deep structural exhaustion of a body and a mind that had been asked to keep going without the one thing that made going possible. The loneliness was there, the specific loneliness of this, of lying in the dark in an apartment in a city full of people. Not one of whom knew what these hours actually contained, not one of whom had been allowed close enough to see it. He lay very still. He did not fight it. He was too tired to fight it. And in that stillness, in the exhausted, surrendered stillness of a person who has finally run out of the energy required to keep running, something that had been sealed shut for a very long time cracked open. Not broke, not shattered, cracked, like the first light coming through a wall you had believed was solid. He lay there in the dark, and he let the weight be the weight. He let the grief be the grief. He let the loneliness be exactly as large as it actually was, without trying to contain it or minimize it or explain away with the vocabulary of fine and managing and just tired. He was not fine. He was not managing. He was a person who had been awake, truly awake, in the deepest and most painful sense of the word, for longer than he had acknowledged even to himself. And somewhere in the hours that followed, he could not have said when exactly, because time in those hours had its own geometry. Somewhere in the long dark of that particular night, something shifted, not resolved, not healed, not fixed, just acknowledged. The way a wound that has been covered for too long finally has to be uncovered before it can begin to close. He lay there, and the thoughts cycled, and the dark pressed in, and the city outside did what cities do. And somewhere around a place where the night starts to become morning, he thought, clearly and without drama, and for what felt like the first time, I cannot keep doing this alone. The thought didn't save him. That is important to say. It didn't fix the sleeplessness or return the years, or repair whatever had been slowly coming undone. The morning would come, and it would be another morning like the ones before it, and the night would come again after. But the thought was real. He had let it be real. And real things, however long they've been waiting in the dark to be seen, have somewhere to go once they are finally acknowledged. They have a direction. They have the possibility of movement. He lay in the dark and held that thought. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, the dark held something else besides a noise. There are people in this world who are awake right now, not by choice, not because they haven't tried, not because sleep is something they've failed to understand or pursue with sufficient effort. They are awake because something inside them will not stop, will not quiet, will not rest, will not give them the mercy of unconsciousness that everyone around them seems to receive without trying. They are awake in apartments and houses and rooms all over the world, lying in the dark of a mind that keeps going while the body begs it to stop. They are, by daylight, fine, managing, tired, but who isn't? And at night, there's something else, something true and unperformed and exhausted in a way that the word exhausted was never designed to carry. If you are one of those people, if any part of this has felt less like a story and more like a mirror, then you already know the thing that Daniel was beginning to understand in those hours, that the dark is not the enemy, that the thoughts are not the enemy, that the real distance is not between sleep and wakefulness, but between what you are carrying and the people who would carry it with you, if you let them. No one should do this alone, not because there is always a solution waiting, not because speaking the thing out loud makes it disappear, but because the weight of the unacknowledged is always heavier than the weight of the true. And there are always people who would rather know, who would sit with you in it, who would turn toward the dark alongside you, instead of letting you face it alone. Daniel lay in his apartment as the city began its slow return to morning. He had not slept, but something had changed in the quality of the wakefulness. Less like siege, more like stillness. Less like being trapped in the noise, more like finally, exhaustedly, sitting down inside it. He would call Marcus in the morning. He didn't know what he would say. He didn't have language for it yet. Not really. Not the kind of language that would make someone else understand what the nights actually contained. But he would call, and maybe that was enough to begin with. Maybe that was, in fact, everything. The night does not last forever. Even the longest ones end. Even the ones that feel, at 3 a.m, like they have always existed and will always exist. Even those ones end. The light comes back. It always comes back. And when it does, you are still here, still yourself, still capable, however tired, of reaching toward another person and saying the thing you've been carrying alone for too long, still capable of beginning,